If you're having irregular bleeding, heavy bleeding, especially bleeding after menopause, you should get evaluated and pay attention to it because endometrial cancer is one of the most common cancers in the United States. And many of these cases can be even prevented or caught early if you know the signs and the symptoms. In this video, we'll go through my top ways to try to avoid endometrial cancer for you or a loved one in the future. Again, my name is Eric Schmidt, board certified OBGYN, and it's September, which is Gynecologic Cancer Awareness Month. And we're doing 30 videos in 30 days. This is video number 3 to raise money for GYN cancer research for things like cervical cancer, endometrial cancer, uterine cancer, because we all know we can't depend on the government anymore to help fund our research, so we got to do it ourselves. As I stated before, endometrial cancer is the most common gynecologic cancer in the United States. It beats ovarian, it beats cervical, and a large part, well, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but it has to do with the increased adipose tissue, the obesity epidemic leading to these endometrial cancers. There's approximately 66,000 endometrial cancers diagnosed per year in the United States. Let's do a quick anatomy review. I use this for much of my demonstrations, but we have the uterus here. These are the ovaries, tubes there. And towards the center, where that depiction of the IUD is, right there, that's the endometrium. That white line right there, that's the endometrium, okay? And that's where these cancers, where the endometrial layer and lining start to develop. And there's generally, we classify it as 2 types of endometrial cancer. Type 1, which is the more common, actually less aggressive kind, but this is vast majority of the endometrial cancers that we see. And then there's type 2, which is luckily less common. This often, unfortunately, though, is more aggressive. This often has a genetic predisposition, whereas type 1 doesn't have as strong of a genetic predisposition to it. So let's go over the different risk factors that someone may have for endometrial cancer so you can potentially at least know or modify them. One of the biggest risk factors is age. We see this in people who are perimenopausal or beyond, through menopause. If someone has postmenopause bleeding, we're always looking out for things like endometrial cancer. One of the other actually really big causes for endometrial cancer, especially that type 1, which we just talked about, is unopposed estrogen. What does that mean? Well, the menstrual cycle has a balance of hormones through the cycle. The estrogen rises, and then there's certain hormones that rise to ovulate, and then ovulation forms the corpus luteum, which secretes a hormone called progesterone. The uterus needs that progesterone, decreases chances of developing endometrial cancer or hyperplasia, which hyperplasia means precancer. Remember in our hormone videos, we talked that if somebody has their uterus still and they want to do hormone replacement, we need to give them a form of progesterone to protect the uterus. Same idea, is we need that progesterone signal to balance the estrogen signal. And so if someone has chronic anovulation, meaning they don't form that corpus luteum because they don't release their egg, and they don't have that progesterone surge, that's what puts somebody at risk. Because now they're just getting an estrogen signal and no progesterone signal because there's no corpus luteum. And also, the fatty tissue in our body is also hormonally active. It secretes estrogen. It converts testosterone to estrogen with the help of an enzyme called aromatase, and this creates excess estrogen, communicating more to that uterus, giving a higher estrogen signal. And even if somebody is ovulating, normally that if it outbalances the progesterone signal, that leads the lining at increased risk because it's getting this signal to grow, and not as much of an opposing signal from the progesterone to even it out and to eventually have a menstruation, and so the lining can build anew. Another increased risk is tamoxifen use. We know tamoxifen because often it's prescribed if someone has a certain type of breast cancer, and they might do 5 years of tamoxifen after that to block the estrogen signal to the breast tissue. However, it doesn't block the estrogen signal to the uterus, and so that uterus continues to get that estrogen signal and then potentially makes those mistakes leading to precancers or cancers. And so that's why, especially with someone on tamoxifen therapy after their breast cancer diagnosis, if they're having irregular bleeding, if they're developing things like polyps along the endometrium, we want to check those out. And tamoxifen kind of doubles the risk of developing those endometrial hyperplasia or cancers. People with PCOS have an increased risk of developing endometrial cancer because they're not having those ovulations, and as we just talked about, they're not getting that progesterone surge to protect their uterus. Okay, so obesity, that's probably the biggest risk factor when it comes to endometrial hyperplasia. If someone has a BMI greater than 40 and excessive adipose tissue, they might have a 7 times increased risk over the general population for endometrial cancer, and that's a huge risk. And actually, it's the biggest risk factor for type 1 endometrial cancer. And we talked before about type 2 endometrial cancer being more rare but more aggressive. We see these with the cancer syndromes, specifically things like Lynch syndrome. And so if you have a family history of cancers, especially colon cancer, you want to get genetic testing to make sure you don't have this Lynch syndrome link, because you may be at higher risk of developing endometrial cancer in the future. Someone with Lynch syndrome has about a 70% increased lifetime risk for endometrial cancer. And same with what we call Cowden syndrome. Again, another genetic syndrome which increases your risk of developing endometrial cancer. It's not as high as Lynch syndrome, but a 28% increased risk with Cowden syndrome for developing endometrial cancer in the future. Now we're off to the top ways to protect yourself against future endometrial cancer. Number 1 is to decrease the adipose tissue to a healthy range. And so obesity epidemic has led to an increase of these endometrial cancers, especially in countries like the United States. And so if we decrease the adipose tissue, you're going to lower your risk, hopefully down to the baseline risk. Item number 2 that you can do to reduce your risk of endometrial cancer is consider a progesterone, especially if obesity or extra adipose tissue is a concern. And this is again why we do it in hormone replacement, is this progesterone protects the uterus lining, and so starting a progesterone could decrease your risk if you have any of these risk factors. This progesterone can come in a number of forms. However, one of the best forms of progesterone to decrease your risk of endometrial cancer would be one of the progesterone IUDs, because they have a high concentration of progesterone right in the uterus with minimal concentration throughout the rest of your body. And while, again, IUDs have the negative connotation out there, they're really good at preventing endometrial cancers, and they're actually the treatment for these precancers of the endometrial lining. And point number 3 for decreasing your risk of endometrial cancer in the future would be know your family history. Get a genetic testing done. See if you have any of these genetic predispositions to these endometrial cancers like Lynch syndrome, Cowden syndrome. And so getting one of these tests done, especially, again, family history of colon cancer, family history of just weird cancers in younger people, you want to get genetic screening done or genetic testing done. And so consider that. Even if you don't even have that history, the more data, the better. All right, everyone, that's video number 3 in our 30 videos in 30 days. There is a link down below for the fundraiser where we're raising money for the GYN cancers. And please, again, every little bit helps. And so if you have the ability to give, thank you very much. Video out tomorrow, so stay tuned, follow along, like the video.